Despite the supposed summer of racial reckoning last year following the murder of George Floyd, there are many Despite people the who now supposed question summer of all, as reports surface that in certain circles, the term itself is used with half-joking disdain. Today we are asking, has the racial reckoning phrase become a rhetorical decoy and a way to avoid facing the deepest problems about race in America, instead of a call to confront them? Experts weigh in. Coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
George Floyd's death sparked what some call the largest protest movement in U.S. history. White support for the Black Lives Matter movement reached an all-time high. Demonstrators toppled Confederate monuments, and so many people bought books on anti-racism that booksellers had trouble keeping them in stock. It seemed as if we were finally turning the corner. A prominent Yale professor said this is the time to strike, the time to take audacious steps to address systemic racial inequality. Bold, sweeping, reparative action, she said. Yet, look at what happened in the months after the U.S. experienced its racial awakening following Floyd's murder. A mob staged a white riot on the U.S. Capitol. Republican lawmakers in 45 states are mounting an attack against Black voters by introducing at least 300 bills to restrict voting. And the $50 billion pledged by corporations to address racial justice issues is unaccounted for. So why do we keep saying that the country has experienced a racial reckoning? Here for our leadoff discussion is Dr. Angel Jones. She is an educator and critical race scholar, a visiting assistant professor at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Dr. Jones's research focuses on microaggressions and racial battle fatigue. Good morning and welcome to the show, Dr. Jones.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with this question. When you look at the attack on the Capitol, the attack on critical race theory, the 300 plus restrictive voting rights bills that have been introduced by Republican legislatures all over this country, and the list kind of just goes on and on. Why do we keep saying the country has experienced a racial reckoning?
I think people say it because it makes them feel better about themselves. I think what actually happened is that people temporarily open their eyes and have conveniently shut them now that the world is reopened and they have other things to care about.
Do we see this so-called, feel better about ourselves, come up with this catchphrase, racial reckoning, when white people are moved to tears or they feel a sense of outrage, whether it was in the 60s when dogs were being, deployed against civil rights marchers, or whether it's, in the current period where we see these really graphic videos of Black men being killed by police. Does it take something, that graphic and visual to even have the beginnings of these conversations?
It shouldn't. And I think that although this racial awakening or reckoning makes white folks feel better, I think it's insulting to us as a Black community. We were dying before George Floyd and we are still dying now. So it's insulting that they just decided to wake up after 9 minutes and 29 seconds of torture.
If we go back to the 60s, the 70s, 80s, there's similar headlines about racial reckonings, whether it's over, busing of kids to, predominantly white schools. And I guess you have to ask the question, if we keep having so many racial reckonings, why does it feel like nothing has really changed for Black people?
Because they're not actual reckonings. I think people give us lip service to try to appease the Black community with the hope that we'll just be quiet and go away, but we will not go away, nor will we be silent about what's happening to our people.
And do you think this conversation, even this phrase, racial reckoning, this is a new phrase that has entered, the zeitgeist in the last, 14 months or so. Is this just a conversation that's happening at universities or happening amongst talking heads on cable news stations? Is this something that real people, everyday people who are, trying to put food on the table and pay their bills, or are they, going around talking about, the racial reckoning is happening now?
They are absolutely not having these conversations. And I guarantee you that most of these people that are having it in institutions and conference meetings and universities aren't even talking about it once they get home either, right? Because their allyship or their anger is so performative that they're only doing it on TV or when at work. But then when they go home, they don't care about us.
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word performative, but another word we're hearing a great deal. Our vocabulary is at least expanding during this period. People are using words that, typically don't get used except on the GRE exam or something. But, if you go into white communities, you see these BLM signs. We support Black Lives Matter. We stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We've seen, as I said in the opening of the show, this increase of books. I live in Los Angeles, and one of the local Black booksellers here said, he had the biggest year ever in the history of his bookstore, and he's been in business over 20 years, right after George Floyd was murdered. He said he had people literally buying in bulk 50, 100 books at a time on issues of race. But, when you look at the real work that has to be done, help us understand, is any of that happening? Beyond just the signs and the buying of books and the attending of lectures, what real work is being done, if any?
Right. So I think the issue is that they are standing in solidarity, but we need them to move in solidarity. We need actual actions, right? So I think a lot of the performative allies, especially on social media, posted to certain things. They all did that whole black box nonsense last summer. And I feel like that allows them to kind of check off the box. See, I'm not racist, right? But we don't need folks to just not be racist. We need them to be actively anti-racist, right? So we need white folks to use their privilege to actually create change. And I do believe that there are some people that are doing the work, both those who are doing the work prior to George Floyd and have now actually awakened and opened their eyes and are being active. But I think that there aren't as many doing the work that pretend to do it.
And what does that work look like? I think some people are confused, and we've heard, a lot of white people saying, hey, we don't know what to do. Tell us what to do beyond reading a book or, putting up a sign on our lawn. What does the real work of racial reckoning look like?
I think for me, there has to first be an acknowledgement of the harm that has been done to our folks, the harm that is currently being done, and the harm that will continue to be done if we don't actually act on it right now. So as an educator, my work specifically looks at racial microaggressions, right, and kind of what that looks like. So the work of Dr. Chester Pierce, he referred to them as psychopollutants, right? So our folks are literally dying.
What was that you said? He refers to them as what?
Psychopollutants, right? Because my work looks at the negative psychological consequences of experiencing racism, right, on a consistent, prolonged basis, which leads to what Dr. William Smith coined racial battle fatigue, right? So there needs to be an understanding and an acknowledgement of what is happening to our folks, right? So we're not just dying at the actual hands of police. We are actually dying, and our mental health is being negatively affected by the racism that we are experiencing on a regular basis, right? So we need to acknowledge that, and we need to actually do something about that. And what does that look like? So as an educator, I spoke specifically on the fact that people need to be educated on what microaggressions are, right? Because I think oftentimes people don't even know that they're doing it, but the lack of intention doesn't change the impact that it's having on folks, right? So I think for me, my focus has always been mental health, and we need to talk about what is happening to our folks in terms of that.
And I guess one of the things we don't talk a lot about it is, is this a zero-sum game? For us to have a racial reckoning, for there to be real change, do white people have to give up something? And I'll make this even more specific. When you think about an issue like housing or homelessness, so you can have a sign on your lawn that says you support Black Lives Matter, but when there's an effort to build moderate to low income housing in your neighborhood, there are efforts to stop that. There's protests, large scale effort to prevent that kind of housing and integration to happen in certain white neighborhoods. Is that an example of when you say something needs to be done or white people have to do something? Is that a prime example? If you say you support Black Lives Matter, then you've got to support, the building of housing in your neighborhood that's going to attract people of color, because that's how we have integrated neighborhoods. That's how, Black kids get access to better schools, etc.
Absolutely. And I think your initial question, right? Do they have to give up something? And the answer is yes. You have to be willing to give up your privilege. And I think that takes a sense of humility and a removing of your ego that I think folks aren't ready to actually do. But you have to be willing to step aside. You have to be willing to amplify the folks of color that are actually doing this work. I think there are a lot of white folks that even when claiming to want to be about that life and complain, expecting others to believe that they care about Black lives are still centering themselves, are still centering their own voices. I mean, they have to give up their position in the center and allow our voices and our work to be highlighted as well.
Professor Cheryl Cashin, she's she writes a lot about race, and she's a race scholar, and she says we got to think about the whole concept of integration, a new form of integration, not the integration that was fought for in the 60s, but she noted that 75% of white people don't have a single non-white friend. I found that statistic to be just, shocking, startling, particularly in 2021. But I could see how it's real. I was just in Martha's Vineyard, and I was in Oak Bluffs, which is the predominantly African-American town. And I went to Edgartown, and the segregation of that little tiny island was just so striking to me, and how that, so many communities across this country are still so incredibly segregated. What do you think about that? This whole notion of not just proximity, but building relationships so that you can really understand the culture, the norms, the traditions of people other than yourself.
I think it's fascinating that 75% of white folks don't know a Black person, when white folks who want us to believe they're not racist are quick to say, oh, but I have a Black friend. Right. So I feel like that to me is fascinating. And I do believe that we need to have relationships. Right. I do believe that allows us to see our humanity. I think a lot of what happens to the Black community is because people don't see us as human. Right. I think, back in the day, we were seen as 3/5 of a person. And I don't know that the mentality of those has changed. I think a lot of people still see us as subhuman. I think us forming those relationships will help people to see us as human, to see our worth, to believe that our Black lives matter because they actually believe that they matter, not just because it's a catchphrase that makes people feel not racist.
And what about the backlash? I mean, we're starting to see this incredible, and I don't know if we're starting to see, maybe it's always been there, but particularly cries from white conservatives, and I don't think we can label them all white supremacists or necessarily even all conservatives, just as white people in general who are feeling attacked, who are saying this whole movement is about anti-whiteness, about shaming them, making them feel guilty. How do we continue to move forward with conversations about race and have these, really hard conversations if white people who need to be very much, centered in these conversations feel as if anytime you talk about race, it's somehow, you're race hustling, or it's a statement about being anti-white.
Right. And I think that's part of white privilege, right? The centering of their own feelings. And I don't believe that their feelings should overrule what's happening to our community. But I always say I don't call people out, I call them higher, right? And I genuinely believe that people do want to do better, right? So my Maya Angelou says, if you know better, you do better, which is why I focus my work on actually educating folks, right? So I do believe that there's a way to educate white folks on their privilege and what's happening in racism and systemic racism without necessarily beating them over the head. I don't believe that is beneficial. I also don't coddle white folks, right? I do believe that there is a way to call them higher and challenge them and have them do the work. And I think that's why I've been successful in the work that I do, because if I'm asking you to see my humanity, I need to see yours as well. And I do believe that people genuinely want to do the work. They just don't know where to start. And I think that fear paralyzes folks. I think having to do that critical self-reflection is hard. But I think letting them know that it doesn't necessarily, I don't really mind where you are starting from, as long as you're willing to do the work to continue to do better.
Yeah. I love that phrase that you don't call people out, you call them higher. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for the work that you are doing, and so incredibly needed. Love the voice that you have on this issue, and thank you for sitting down with me this morning.
I appreciate you so much. Thank you.
All right, take care. My next guest, you've seen her on the show before. Her name is Mary Frances Winter. She's the CEO of the Winters Group. She's the author of Black Fatigue, How Racism erodes the mind, body, and spirit. And she's also a 37-year diversity and inclusion specialist. So she knows a lot about this topic. Welcome back to the show, Mary Frances.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Good to see you again. I want to read you an excerpt from a recent Washington Post article. Here's the excerpt. It says, big business pledged nearly $50 billion for racial justice after George Floyd's murder, but $45.2 billion is allocated as loans and investments they could stand to profit from. Also, the article went on to say companies also said they were diversifying their workforces up to the highest paid C-suite jobs, as well as increasing their purchases of goods and services from Black businesses. Have you heard this before?
I've heard this before, 37 years in this work. I've heard this before. I think that to what Dr. Jones was saying, a lot of it is performative. We are working with a lot of very, very large companies. I will not out the names of my clients right now. And we are having problems. The resistance is real. So let me tell you how it's happening. The CEO declares this, the CEO and the C-suite, they declare, they made these statements, we're going to do this, we're going to do more diversity training, we're going to focus specifically on anti-racism training. Now, what has happened is there is just swift backlash. I've been doing diversity work. As long as you talk about cultural competence, as long as you talk about, everybody and inclusion and belonging, and you don't specify, you don't talk about race in particular, particularly not, race as it relates to African Americans and Blacks, we're okay. As soon as you start talking about that, it's not okay. So my team, I have a team of 20 people, and my team, we are fatigued. We are fatigued because we're designing anti-racism, education, and we're getting the backlash that such and such didn't like it. You made them feel bad.
Well, let me just really set the stage here. So the CEO has issued a statement. We want an anti-racist culture. We want to, rid our culture of any racial bias. That gets put out by the leader, the top. Somebody decides to bring your group in or a group like yours in. You start to carry out or execute on the plan of the CEO. And who are the people that then write, and I don't know, are these anonymous notes to the CEO, or are they willing to sign their name to say, oh, that made me feel bad?
So many of them are not anonymous. I work in the C-suite a lot, where I'm working with the CEO and usually his direct reports. And it's usually the direct reports who are saying, well, we need to back away. And here's the other thing that happens is that it gets delegated to the diversity office. And the diversity officers, they are fatigued as well because they're trying to carry it out, but they're getting pushback from middle management where they're saying, our people are not liking this. We're making people feel badly. We're blaming and shaming, and we are not blaming and shaming. That's how it's being interpreted. When we talk about white supremacy culture, people just, that is a really, really triggering, for people. And we know that there's a readiness, but I maintain, when are we going to be ready? We've been looking at inequities for over 400 years now. And I've been doing this for 37 years, where we've been back and forth, where this, it's popular and then it's not. And what happens is we center the comfort of white people in power. And when they become uncomfortable, then things have to be shut down. I just got a note from an email from a client yesterday who said, can you change this image? We don't like this image. There are too many Black people in this image. Can you not say, can you not use the word racism? Is there another word that we can use? This is my everyday reality.
Okay, Mary Frances, you got to tell me, what is the other word for racism?
Inequities.
Oh, okay. That's not as hard for them to hear and to accept. Inequities is more general. Oh,
correct.
Let me ask you this: these CEOs. So when you say to them, Bob, the CEO said this is what he wanted, is Bob willing to lay the law down to the employees and say, toughen up, get over it, this is the reality, or does Bob back away too?
Some Bobs are willing to step forward and to say, this is what I said, because some of them have said it in a video. We have them do a little video before we do our learning. And some of them are saying, yes, this is what we're going to do. If you want to work here, you're going to listen to this. We do a history, we talk about the history of racism. We look at issues of statistics and all of those kinds of things, and we talk about the bias, all of those things that we do in our learning. And some CEOs are saying yes. Others, even CEOs of color, are backing away and saying, we have to make it a little bit more palatable for our people.
And beyond just, bringing you in and thank God you have this successful company and I'm glad to see you doing this work. But, are the CEOs doing anything other than just hiring folks like you? Are they doing anything to change the culture? Like, ensuring that there are more African Americans in the C-suite? Because when I look at the numbers are horrible.
The numbers are really horrible, and they, some are working on it. However, again, as you well know, we've been working on this for many, many, many years, and the excuse that we can't find any, that is not palatable or reasonable or true at all anymore. There are many, many qualified Black people. But what's happening too, particularly at some of these high levels, people, the Great Resignation, there are Black people who are checking and saying, I just can't do this anymore. It's just too much of an emotional burden to be that token, too much of an emotional burden to try to push, a diversity in this organization. My mental health.
Yeah, it's more important. You gave the example of someone asking you to find a softer, better, more accepting word than racism, which, in and of itself is really ridiculous. Give us another example of something where you've been told to water down or dilute a concept to make the audience feel more comfortable.
So yes, so white supremacy culture, we're being asked to use dominant culture or Eurocentric culture, because I think the word white is triggering. Pew does a study every year, and only 15% of white people think that their race is core to their identity. And so it just to hear the term white is very triggering for many of them, and they don't think it's important. Why do we even have to talk about race? It's not important. So that would be another example of not using that language. So any language that suggests that there is systemic racism. So that's another term that people some back away from or ask us to put. And the other thing that they want us to do is they want us to make sure that we're not just talking about inequities as they relate to Black people, that we absolutely have to include brown people.
Do they make you include white women?
They haven't been asking as much to include white women this go round. Not as much. Yeah.
Okay. That was in prior decades when white women were considered also marginalized populations and thrown into the whole category of disadvantaged people. I want to bring into the conversation now Dr. Frank Dobbins. He's a professor at Harvard University, and his research focuses on organizations, inequality, economic behavior, and public policy. He's the author of several books, including Inventing Equal Opportunity. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Dobbins. You're listening to Mary Frances, and I guess one of the questions I have is, and I know your research centers around this, do these diversity training programs even work? Are they worth the paycheck that Mary Frances and her colleagues even get?
Well, I think there's good evidence that they are very effective for people who are open to hearing the message. But as Mary Frances has been saying, a lot of people are not open to hearing the message. So we see some evidence that cultural competence training gets people who know there's a problem and who are willing to play some role in solving the problem, gets them on board. The problem is that, as Mary Frances was just saying, there are often a lot of people up and down the hierarchy who don't recognize that there's a problem, don't recognize that we have racial segregation at the workplace, don't recognize that we have racial exclusion in many workplaces. And those are the people who need more than just some kind of diversity training. So let me say two things about the research on diversity training. One thing we see with implicit bias training, which is what a lot of the diversity training focus on now, is that, so this is, are you unconsciously biased, and making you aware that you're unconsciously biased. What we see is that kind of training makes people aware that there's a problem in the world, but it doesn't change their own level of bias. So if you are biased going into it unconsciously, they do a measure at the end, you're just as biased coming out. So that's not something we're going to change, obviously, in an hour or a day, or frankly, the studies show in a week of diversity training. You can't get rid of people's unconscious stereotypes about groups. What you can do is you can give them some information about what's going on in the workplace and some information about what the problems are. And that's what Mary Frances is involved in doing. And certainly the people who are on board with that are going to acquire some useful knowledge about, for example, the extent of segregation in their own firm. But the problem is we're not going to change bias. And on average, diversity training programs don't lead to changes in what the workforce looks like. So diversity training is a step, but it's not going to solve the problem alone. And I think that's what our research shows. In fact, our research shows that the typical kind of diversity training, and now it's mostly online, which covers the law, and most companies begin with diversity training for managers. This legalistic training for managers leads to backlash that actually leads to reductions in Black people, Black men and women in management. And that is very discouraging. So
help us understand, Dr. Dobbins, what is it about the training that leads to the backlash? Is it that white people don't want to be told what to do or who to hire, or they think they're being told what to do and who to hire?
I think that's exactly it. That's what the psychological research suggests, and that's what we do research on firms. So we look at hundreds of firms over dozens of years, and we have enough data to figure out what the introduction of, for example, this kind of legalistic diversity training, very different from what Mary Frances offers, what this kind of legalistic diversity training does, and people feel that they are being coerced to hire more diverse teams. And most of the people in diversity training for managers are white men, because most managers are white men. And so they just react negatively. We also see negative effects for white women. So, it seems like what happens inside of the minds of these guys is somebody's trying to force me to do something that I don't want to do. Somebody's trying to force me to make my team look different, and they resist that. So I do think that companies have to be careful about diversity training, and companies can make significant progress on integrating their workforces by paying attention to recruitment, mentoring, training, and work-life programs, and making sure that all of those career systems are really inclusive, so that Black and brown people, men and women, are integrated from the beginning in the career system and all the way through that.
So, Mary Frances, the kind of training that Dr. Dobbins talked about is different than what we saw in some cases after George Floyd. I had Robin DiAngelo on the show last week, and Robin's book, White Fragility, just flew off the shelves, sold over 1 million copies after George Floyd's murder. She was in high demand, doing 10, 12 of these workshops, diversity training workshops every month with some of the biggest companies, and there was an article written about, she was getting paid $15,000, $20,000 a pop for these talks. Is hearing it, you're a Black woman, Robin's a white woman, are these audiences from your 37 years of experience more inclined to hear and to be moved to change by listening to Robin DiAngelo, a white woman, than they are by listening to Mary Frances, a Black woman?
Wow. Yes, that's a whole nother topic. So I think so. Over the 37 years, I have heard many times from Black people who are in the diversity spot. Mary Frances, we'd love to hire you. However, we need to hire a white person because they're going to hear it better from a white person. But I've gotten over that. My firm is doing extremely well. I stuck it out 37 years. We have a great reputation. We do not do. I do not start with implicit bias training. I don't think that is where you start. So somebody calls us, they want to do implicit bias training. We're not the ones, and we don't do a one and done. If you just want a one and done, a 2-hour session or something, I'll do a keynote for you. I'll inspire you. I'll give you facts, but I'm not going to call that a training, because that is not training. So what we're doing now is we're doing sessions that are four segments. This first one is really about understanding self, understanding, what is my background? How did I come to believe, what I believe, those kinds of things. The second session goes more into how others believe differently. The third session goes more into my book on inclusive conversations. How do we have these conversations? The fourth session is about the systems. How do we change systems? I can't change a system if I don't understand how I'm a part of the system. In between those learnings, we also have reflective work. We also have them doing their own reflective work. We look at a readiness. We do a readiness assessment before we get into this to say what learning are you ready for. You don't put people into advanced algebra before they've had algebra 101. I use that phrase all the time. And so we're putting people into work where they don't have the foundation to really unpack it. This is where we get the pushback. This is where we get the resistance. And so one really, really major client of ours, they have invested for all of their leaders into many, many, many hours of learning. We don't even call it training. We call it learning. The learning is not all in the classroom. Some of that learning is happening in discussions that they're having, after these sessions. Some of that learning is happening in communities. And so we have a very holistic approach to learning, because I agree with Dr. Dobbin that if you're just doing legalistic, which we don't do, as he said, we don't do that at all. And if you're just doing a one and done, it doesn't make any sense. But here's the pushback that we're getting now. People are saying, well, we can't have our leaders in these 4-hour sessions, 4-hour sessions. That just takes too much away from the work. So if you don't see this as a part of your work, if you don't see this as a part of what you do as an organization, then, we're being a little bit more selective now about, who we work with, because it's just so difficult to work with those organizations where they're asking us to be the ones to convince the leaders that they should be doing this. The leaders already have to be there, that this is what we want to do. We see the value of it, right, and we understand that it is a journey.
Dr. Dobbin, I want to go back to this question though about, Robin DiAngelo and white women like her that do diversity training. Has your research shown that companies are more inclined to receive and perhaps take action if they're hearing these harsh, truths about race and racism from a white person? Mary Frances said people said they can't even use the word white. Can Robin DiAngelo stand in front of a white crowd and use the word white without being, vilified for doing so?
Areva, I don't think there's been research on who presents the training, but I have also noticed that more firms used to want a person of color to do the training, and now more firms seem to be open to having white people do the training. I will say that I like Robin DiAngelo's book. I find it interesting, but when we look at the message that it sends, it's really a message about white supremacy. And going back to what Mary Frances said before, the people who are problematic are not going to respond well to that message. I just don't, because it comes off as blaming individual managers for their own racism. And even if that is the main thing that's going on to exclude people of color from the workplace, it's just not going to play well with those people because they can't hear it. They turn off. So, the issue of who presents the message, I personally think, I find when I'm talking to executives, I used to say white supremacy because I thought they needed to hear it from me. I don't do diversity training, but I interview people all the time. And I tried to stop using that because I find people whites react negatively to it unless they're already on board.
But Dr. Dobbin, how can you talk about eliminating a problem if you can't even call the problem by its real name? So if you got to go around making up, it's not the sun, it's something else. How are we going to talk about, skin cancer if we can't talk about the cause of skin cancer is the sun? So I don't understand how we get there beyond performative press releases and millions of dollars in training that both of you that have been in this business a long time says isn't really moving the needle.
I feel like a lot of what companies do is just a form of gaslighting. So they're saying, look, we have the latest in implicit bias training. Look, we have a Black person on our board. Look, we have a rule that 20% of our suppliers have to be people of color. whereas they're not focusing on actually changing what goes on in the company. And my concern is that talk of white supremacy isn't going to change what goes on in the company either, especially if it turns off a bunch of people. So I mean, it's the language I use myself, but I backed away from using it when I'm talking to executives. I think we have to take on the harder tasks of, it was mentioned before that there isn't really a pipeline problem anymore. I think that was you, Mary Frances. There isn't a pipeline problem anymore. Companies should be able to hire Black people, but they're not recruiting at the right places. They're not recruiting Latinx people at the right places. Companies should be able to retain and promote Black people and Latinx people, but they're not, because they're not mentoring those people. So we need to fix the recruitment system. We need to fix.
But Dr. Dobbins, you can't fix the recruitment issue if you don't acknowledge that the recruitment issue is tied up into your white supremacy culture. So recruitment doesn't exist in a vacuum. The people that are doing the recruitment are the same white people who don't want to hear the word white.
So the question is, can you change the culture directly by telling people we need a new culture and by saying, here's our culture? Or do you change the culture by changing the way people behave? And as a sociologist, I think we often change the culture by changing the way people behave. And so what's one way to do that? One way to do that is to get all of your departments to recruit every year at historically Black colleges and universities and at Latinx serving institutions. So how are you going to change the culture? I mean, you're going to change the way those people think through the recruitment visits, the people who go to recruit. So, I mean, I think there's a two-way street here. You've got culture and you've got behaviors or routines. In sociology, we tend to think that you have to change the routines to get the culture to change. And so if you want people to start being more inclusive, you've got to get them out there recruiting at historically Black colleges. You have to get managers mentoring people of color.
Yeah, I hear you saying that, Dr. Dobbin, but you think as a sociologist, I think as a civil rights lawyer, and I'll tell you that you can't get people out there doing that. It's the stick or the carrot. And what we've seen is these companies don't respond to much until it impacts their bottom line. I want to ask you, Mary Frances, did you see the Coca-Cola backlash after this employee posted a screenshot from a diversity training, some materials that encourage staff to be less white?
That was Robin DiAngelo, by the way.
Yeah, that was from some of her training material. Less white, less arrogant.
It wasn't ours. Yeah.
It wasn't yours. But, I bring that up as again, to talk about this whole backlash that we're seeing. Right. And obviously once that was posted on social media, Twitter went crazy. Conservatives glommed onto it to criticize the whole notion of diversity training. And again, the persecution of white people being criticized for being white and being told to be less white. And then there was the incident of Sam Club CEO Rosalind Brewer, who faced backlash after, some statements she made about suppliers being all white men. That started trending on Twitter, boycott racist Sam's Club. So I just wonder how we make any progress if comments from, Rosalind Brewer, the first Black, woman CEO of Sam Clubs, makes a factual statement, not a racist statement, not a, inaccurate statement, but a factual statement about the white men who are the primary suppliers of goods and items at Sam's Club. I think we have to keep. Can't say that. How do we go? Where do we go, and how do we get there?
I think we have to say it, and I think we have to press through. So here's a model that says you're either at denial, polarization, minimization, acceptance, adaptation. Dr. Dobbin, no way. This is the intercultural development continuum. We have a lot of people at polarization right now. It's either this or it's this. Very absolute. We need to bring people to this place of minimization, right? So minimization is not the end point, though. Minimization is where we're looking at what we have in common. So when we start talking about how we're talking about white supremacy culture and how Black people have been traumatized, we need to talk about, I believe, we need to talk about the trauma that all of us have gone through historically. If you read my grandmother's hands, Resma's work, and if you read The Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, she talks about the fact that we've all been subject to violence in some kind of way historically. You can go back to the Middle Ages with the guillotines and whatnot, and people who believe that this trauma intergenerationally is in our bodies. So Resmaa talks about in My Grandmother's Hands about why police, are prone to, to be more violent. But the idea is first to say, hey, we all have trauma. We've all experienced it in different ways. So we start there. The other way that we can start, is to talk about, our different lived experiences and what those commonalities are. Once we get there, then I believe we can go deeper and break away to say, but Black people have experienced this differently. And the difference is this physical characteristic that we cannot take off. Irish people at one time were not considered white. Italian people at one time were not considered white. And so if we can get from that historical piece, that we've all come through this journey, however, it has impacted women differently. It's impacted the LGBTQ community, differently, because, all cancers are not the same, right? And so we just say, well, let's just talk about cancer. Well, no, we have to talk about the different kinds of cancer. So I believe that we first have to come to this notion of what is our common ground before we can go deeply then into what are our differences. Or we're just going to stay at polarization. We're going to be doing oppression Olympics. We're going to be doing, and we're going to look at, I think the other thing, and I'm talking fast because I know you have other guests, but the other thing is we have to stop looking at this as a zero-sum game, as a world of scarcity, where if you get this, then I don't get that. Right? I mean, I think that's the mindset, and that's the kind of culture that we need to change. Dr. Dobbins, in all fairness and respect for you, 37 years, we've been recruiting for 37 years. You've been recruiting at HBCUs for 37 years. You still get, when the rubber meets the road, you still get who's the hiring manager. And a white person, this is where the bias comes in. A white man is more likely to hire a white man and find something wrong with the Black person, right? And so that's what has happened over the years and what is continuing to happen. So I don't think, and mentoring, I believe in reciprocal mentoring. I believe that those who are in positions of power can learn just as much from those who perhaps are trying to get there. So the programmatic solutions, which I think sometimes do have some impact, unless they are embedded in a bigger systemic effort, I don't think the programmatic solutions have worked either.
Yeah,
Can I just say one word about
Dr. Dobbins? I got to bring in my other guest, Dr. Patricia Banks. She's a sociologist too, like you. She's a professor at Mount Holyoke College and the author of multiple books on race, culture, and consumption. She's the author of Race, Ethnicity, and Consumption, and her forthcoming book is Black Culture, Inc., How Cultural Patronage Pays for Business. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Banks. You've been listening to this conversation. I know a lot of your work focuses on consumers and how consumers and how businesses respond to their consumers. What do you make of what we saw after the murder of George Floyd and big companies coming out with these press releases and the hiring of these diversity training professionals? Was it all performative in your estimation? I think you're on mute, Dr. Banks.
Thank you. So I'm delighted to be here. And so much of what everyone has said so far really resonates with what I found in my research. So my forthcoming book that you just shared with Stanford University Press is a study that's looking at how corporations use race-related philanthropy as a form of what I call diversity capital. So it's a way for them to signal to consumers and other stakeholders that they value diversity. So that's exactly what we saw in this moment of the outreach of philanthropy right after the unrest last year. So we saw billions of dollars being pledged. And really, it's very interesting when we start to think about what we've heard so far is the management side. So some of what's going on with management not really working. Well, that's really consistent with what I'm finding with philanthropy, and that, corporations, it's really important for them in moments moments like that to signal to the public that they do care about diversity. So I think that is very much what's going on, is it's a form of racial image construction, that they care about African Americans and they care about racial justice.
Well, there was a recent article in the Washington Post, Dr. Banks, that says 50 billion with the B pledged. 45 billion of that is in the form of loans and investments that actually benefit the corporations. And then the basis of this article is simply that the money is unaccounted for. There's no way of tracking it. Lots of organizations that are doing the work that is supposed to be the intended beneficiaries of these pledges haven't seen the money. So, what are we to make of? It sounds great, $50 billion, lots of philanthropy by corporations, but, is it real?
Right. So it's interesting. So there are a couple of things going on. So on one hand, there is a degree to which some of it hasn't been accounted for, but I think that precisely is what is consistent with my findings about diversity capital. It's about signaling. So they make a pledge. The pledge is public. It's communicated. And so most people are just going to read about, they're going to hear about the pledge on the news. So it has performed its function. And that people believe that the company has given. So that's true on one hand. Then I think on the other hand, one of the things that we have to remember is that some of the money is accounted for. So some of the money is given. When we look at companies, my research historically has been on cultural philanthropy, and you have companies who pledged, for example, Bank of America gave a big pledge to support the Smithsonian and the National Museum of African American History and Culture and some of their race-related initiatives. And Bank of America has given in the past, so I would expect that they will fulfill that pledge. Walmart, in January, a few months before the uprisings in 2020, they made a $5 million pledge to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So there is a history, there is a set of practices where these companies are giving. And in that sense, when we think about inequality in the nonprofit sector, because one of the things we know is that nonprofits that are led by African Americans, that are serving African Americans, they tend to have less access to capital than their majority counterparts. So these corporate gifts, on that sense, are very important. But there's also this other side.
Yeah, and I'll ask you, Mary Frances, are these huge corporate gifts a way to divert attention away from the real work that is happening inside these organizations? Because what we saw after some of those big pledges were made were employees in these companies saying, well, wait a minute, you're giving $50 million to the African American Museum, and you are paying your Black employees at this company less than minimum wages. We don't have health care. We don't have paid leave. We don't have opportunities for promotion. So it's great that you're giving away $50 million to support the arts, but what about doing the work in your own organization?
Absolutely. And for many of these organizations, they're not given the 50 million. Some of the donations that they're given compared to their size is minuscule. It's chump change to them, right? And so it helps the African American organization. However, it's not helping them to the extent that that it could. So yes, this is a check the box kind of thing. Check the box. Let's get some good publicity. We're good people, and we're done. We had a client who the Black employees came forward. They only had 36 Black, it was a smaller company, 2,000 people. It had 36 Black employees. And they learned, because the Black employees came forward, that in fact, half of them were being underpaid by this company's own standards. And I was just so livid about that, because how can you not know that half of your Black employees are being underpaid? This is a tangible thing. And so, as a result, it had to be as a result of George Floyd. Why did it have to be because of that they started to, obviously bring them up to pay? But you know what the CEO said to me? He said, well, many of them weren't being paid where they wanted to be, where they should have been, because they didn't ask.
Wow.
Yes. So yes, yeah. The internal, yes, they're not putting the money necessarily to the internal development.
That level of oppression, we're going to oppress them. Dr. Dobbins, I'll let you back in. You wanted to make a point before I brought in Dr. Banks.
I just wanted to say about recruitment. Mary Frances was saying we've been recruiting at HBCUs for years. I mean, what our analyses show is that if a company starts recruiting at an HBCU, 5 years later, there are a lot more Black men and women in management than there were. So it's true that in the aggregate, there are things that we're trying that maybe in some companies don't work. But in many companies, recruitment is the first step. You've got to get out there and actually look specifically for people of color.
I want to bring into the conversation now Dr. Dibinga, Omekongo Dibinga. He's a regular on the show. He's a professor at American University, and he's also a diversity and inclusion expert. Welcome back, Dr. Dibinga. I want to ask you about these book publishing companies. So we saw these companies publishing books by Black authors. I've interviewed tons of Black authors who have had New York Times bestselling books in the wake of George Floyd's murder. But now there are imprints that are, responding to those books with their own version of history. There's an imprint called Emancipation Books that's devoted to publishing those writers who have a different view about race. There's a book coming out called Race Crazy, BLM, Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers. And this is meant to be a corrective to the 1619 Project. There's a lot of hunger on the right for these books. And a lot of white conservatives feel like, they want to tell their story. Is this what we should expect moving forward? Is that we'll see this kind of backlash, not just retrenching in the corporate setting, but even in the books and the media, we'll see white conservatives saying, hey, enough is enough. We're tired of these conversations about diversity and inclusion and systemic racism. Let's call these people race hustlers.
Absolutely. And we see it not only in the publishing industry, we're seeing it in our K-12 and our university institutions as well, where people are talking about getting rid of things like critical race theory. And just for full disclosure, critical race theory is not taught from the K-12 level for people who are not familiar with that terminology. But quite honestly, yes. And this is why when it comes to the publishing industry itself, we have to be mindful of considering the source because their interest in profits. I mean, the same people that are going to publish books about anti-racism are going to publish books by people like Kellyanne Conway and Donald Trump and the others. And so we have to make sure that we're doing the work to seek out and listen to real experts like your panel here, Dr. Banks, Dr. Winters, or Francis Winters as well. Because really at the end of the day, if we keep letting the media feed us who we're supposed to talk to, we're going to continually fall victim to whoever they say is the flavor of the month or the flavor of the moment. And we're seeing that with these publishers as well, in terms of the books that they're putting out. They're kind of just going with the flow. Oh, this is what people want. Okay, let's just find those authors. And we have to go deeper and do better than that.
Yeah, I started the show by really asking, is this a period of racial reckoning? Or really is this a period where whites are grasping at reclaiming white innocence? I'll start with you, Mary Frances. I'd love to get all of your opinion on that. Do you think we're really having a racial reckoning of substance at this moment? Or, white people just saying, we want to feel good and we don't want to be made to feel bad. So don't use these words that hurt our feelings.
Yeah, so last year I wrote about, is this a moment or a movement? And I said, and time will tell. And I think here we are a year and a half later, and I think it was a moment. But we can look through history. We've had these moments before, right, throughout history. And white supremacy is just so embedded and so strong, the white dominant and being in that power position that any attempts to actually address historic and systemic racism in this country, it gets shut down. This is not the first time.
Yeah.
That's how critical race theory actually got started in the 70s with Kimberly Crenshaw and company. And they were looking at, we had the civil rights movement here. We had passed all these laws, but wait a minute, it doesn't seem like anything is changing. So that's really how critical race theory started, to look at why have we not made progress even after, the protests and all of the things that happened, in the 60s. And here we are again in 2021 asking the same question. Where is the progress? I talk about that in my book, Black Fatigue. I have a whole chapter, Then is Now. You can look at a whole bunch of statistics and just see nothing has happened. But I think that there is such a strong push to keep things to the status quo because it's comfortable for white people. Why do they want to change? I used to talk about people who did power and privilege kinds of training in corporations. I said, why are you doing power and privilege? People who have power want to keep power. So you're going to tell them that they have power? You're going to say, oh yeah, I got the power, right? So yeah, so exactly. It's a moment, not a movement. And I think unless we continue, like shows like yours, Areva, we have to keep the full court press on, and that is fatiguing. It's fatiguing.
It is exhausting, to say the least. Dr. Dobbins, I'll ask you, is this a moment in our movement, as Mary Frances said, are we really having a racial reckoning in this country, or, are we just trying to placate white people?
I mean, it looks like a moment to me, just because I've been around long enough to see a lot of moments like this that didn't eventuate in any real change. So I think that's the negative side of this. This could all be gone, and we are seeing a lot of backlash against it. There was a lot of change in the early 1970s in firms, for example, in educational systems. A lot of companies really changed what the mid-career managers looked like in between 1970 and 1975, and then there was backlash against that. There was a financial crisis brought on by the OPEC oil embargo. Started in 1973. Then there was reverse discrimination lawsuits. So it turned back pretty quickly, and I have to say today looks kind of like that again. But I think what's promising is we recognize that what's happening in employment, in the firm, in the university, is systemic racism. We have a term for it. So systems are racist, and we need to change the system. So I think we've been too focused on trying to change people's minds. And as I was saying before, it's just hard to change stereotypes in people's head. I would give up on that. Mary Frances has given up on it. She's not doing implicit bias training, but we need to change systems. And that's why I say, all the companies out there, if you're not recruiting at historically Black colleges, and I mean recruiting for all your jobs up and down the line, you have to do that. You have to be recruiting at Latin serving institutions, and you have to send your own managers out to do that. And that's just the first in many systems that we need to change.
But Dr. Dobbins, we're not retaining.
I haven't given up on that though.
We can recruit all day long, but we're not retaining.
That's why we have to change mentoring systems. That's why we have to change management training systems to open these things up to everybody. So I'm not saying that recruitment is where you can solve the problem. It's the first of many systems that are part of the career system that we've got to change, and that's what systemic racism in the firm is.
All right, Dr. Dibinga, jump in here, and then I'll give Dr. Banks the last word on this.
Well, I was saying that I haven't given up on the bias side of things and the personal. I've actually found that in recent activities I've been doing with organizations, that has been the most effective aspect of it, is getting people to personally probe their own experiences as it relates to racism and issues that, whether they were the perpetrators or the victims, whether they grew up in a family that was that, getting people to understand that we're all products of our environment and we're not responsible for that, but we're responsible for what we do from here. And then after that, one of the things I see in these organizations is they say things like we're against racism and systemic racism, and they're like, but they've never defined it. So we spend a lot of time in these organizations actually just agreeing to what racism is versus systemic racism, the individual versus the dynamics that may be happening across the country in a governmental system. The basic conversations that should be happening in our high schools and in our universities are things that I'm finding we have to do on some of these corporate levels. And unfortunately, it's necessary, but I find that to be effective to get a conversation started.
All right, Dr. Banks, give you the last word on this. Is this a period of racial reckoning, or a period where whites are just grasping at reclaiming what they believe to be their white innocence?
Well, I think this is a question that many people are asking. One of the projects I'm involved with is a major study with donors of color with the Lilly School of Philanthropy. So did a bunch of focus groups with donors of colors. And that was one of the concerns that they have. They're very optimistic about the broader philanthropic field shifting. But the question is, will it continue? And I think that that time will tell. One of the interesting things that's gone on with Walmart is Walmart, in response to the unrest, actually started a $100 million fund that they're going to disperse over 5 years. And so to a degree, that's an example of a firm that has institutionalized race and racial considerations in their philanthropy. So clearly it will last 5 years for them. I think the question is, will it last beyond that? So I think time will tell. I think companies like Walmart that have institutionalized it, at least we'll see some change in the short term.
And is Walmart going to pay its employees a living wage while they give away $100 million? I think that's the question that concerns so many people is, yes, bravo to the $100 million. But what about the single mother that can't make enough working at a Walmart to support her kids, send her kids to daycare and feed her family? So how do we get those intentions in sync? Yes, do the philanthropy, fantastic, wonderful. But as Mary Frances said, and Dr. Dobbins says, hire them. Mary Frances says, retain them and promote them and give them power. So, are you seeing, that happening in tandem? Because it's still performative to give away $100 million, but you got Black people working for $12 an hour in a city like Los Angeles where they cannot, rent an apartment and feed themselves.
And that's precisely what the cost of diversity capital is. That's what the cost is. So it allows companies to seem as if they're doing something significant, and there are significant aspects of it, but you precisely identified what the cost is. And so the solution is they need to work together. So if you're going to make this gesture, the way to do it authentically is to make sure that throughout the organization, throughout the firm, you have these practices that promote equity.
Yeah, we say, take care of home first, basically. So thank you for the press release. Thank you for the money you're giving away. But, start at home. Charity starts at home. Got to end this conversation. So interesting. Thanks to all of you. Always good to see you, Mary Frances, Dr. Dibinga, of course. And thank you for joining us this morning, Dr. Dobbins and Dr. Banks. A really interesting conversation. All I can say is watch this space. We'll know whether this is a moment or a movement, and we're going to know pretty quickly because things are moving pretty rapidly. Again, thanks to all of you for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. What an interesting conversation. Whenever we talk about race, always some triggering words. We talked about trigger words this morning. Couldn't even imagine that Mary Frances and her colleagues can go into a corporation and a white person sitting in a train, he says, oh, don't say white because that makes me uncomfortable. Don't say systemic racism, that makes me uncomfortable. So lots going on around this whole conversation about racial reckoning. And I'm glad we're here at the Special Report. We're here for it. We're here for these tough conversations. We're here for, bringing on experts who are, on the ground, boots on the grounds, having these conversations with power brokers and power makers in this country. And we know that we're not going to change these systems if we can't even use the word white. If white is a bad word, oh my God, how much more work do we have to do? But we're here for it, and we're going to just stay on this. I say watch this space because we're going to continue to have these difficult conversations. And we can't fix what we don't acknowledge. And we are acknowledging today, as we have every day of the last year and a half, that America has a problem. And, some folks are committed to changing it, but a lot of folks just want to window dress. And that's sad, but that's the truth. That's the reality of where we are. Just some words to live by before I get out. And they're by the iconic author James Baldwin. James Baldwin often talked about innocence when he talked about racism. In his book, In the Fire Next Time, he wrote, I know, and this, the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. But it is not permissible that the author of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. Really profound words by James Baldwin, and leads me back to the question again: are we really in a period of racial reckoning, or a period where whites are reclaiming their white innocence, the innocence that James Baldwin wrote about? We don't want to teach our kids honestly about our past or present. White conservatives don't want to question their allegiance to. They don't want us to question their allegiance to openly white supremacist political leaders like Donald Trump. They, impugn the institutions that uphold the white supremacies. They do not impugn these institutions, even though these institutions, many of which uphold white supremacy. And most importantly, it's been said, today, white folks want to be absolved from their sins of having made these demands. In short, they want us to affirm their innocence. And by the way, they also want us to stop demanding justice because it makes them feel bad. And we can add to that list, even using the word white makes them feel bad. I don't know. Lots to think about if we can't use the word white. I think that's the note I'm going to end on. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask, and don't forget we're all in this together.